I wasn't at Roswell in 47. 47, I'd just come back from Italy. I'd been chief of security intelligence in Rome. And in the intelligence business, I was trained really by the British. I was an MI-19. So when I came back, one night I was a post-duty officer. Post-duty officer means that I was in control. For that night, I was the one that checked all the guards, checked all security areas. In fact, checked the whole post. I was the duty officer that night. And I went to the veterinarian section, and one of a sergeant I knew very well was sergeant of the guard that night. I told him, Sarge, how's everything around here? And he said, fine, sir. I told him, you know, they told me to be careful to watch this area because you have a sense of something sensitive here. He said, you want to see it, sir? I told him, yes, let's go look. And I knew this sergeant very, he was a master sergeant. I went back, and there was 5 crates there, like 5 or 6, I think it was 5. I lifted one up, and here's this body there and floating in fluid. And I looked at it about 10, 15 seconds, not much more than that. So I put it back down and I said, Sarge, come on, get out of here now. I don't want to get you in trouble. Because I'm the duty officer, I can go around, walk around here. But you might get in trouble for coming back. Just come on, let's go. Come out with me. So we went out, and I told him, where did it come from, Sarge? He said, well, 5 trucks are coming through here from an airfield in New Mexico, and they're heading for Wright-Patterson Air Force. Now, in those days, you know, there weren't all these big roads now. In those days, Route 40 was about the only cross-country route, and the route that they took was Route 40, going through Fort Riley, Kansas, and then up to Wright-Patterson Air Force. And I said, well, stay away from her, Sergeant. I don't want you to get in any trouble. I told him I can walk around and see it. So, and I started to figure, what was that? First, I thought it was a child, because it was small. Then I looked at this head and all, right away, and this was only happened in a matter of seconds. Then I put the end back down, and the head was different, the arms were spindly, the body, it was gray. So right at that moment, I figured, I don't know what this thing is. So like in intelligence business, I just better put it in the back of my head here and wait till maybe in the future I get corroboration so I can evaluate what it is. So I promptly forgot about it. 10 years later, I was down there, commanded the range in New Mexico, in White Sands, the Army missile firing range, in northern, right near Trinity site, my headquarters was. So my own radar started picking up items going 3,000 to 4,000 miles an hour in this area. I had pencil beam radars which locked on the target. And the boys told me at about 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour, quick acceleration, they break the lock. And that was one of the best radars we had during the time. So every time that would happen, once I notified our headquarters, they said, oh, forget it, we're not interested. So I figured I won't tell them anything anymore. So every time that would happen, I'd tell the boys, bring me the tapes. Because all my computers and my firing had a tape which gave the whole firing sequence. And then we could check it after if anything went wrong, see? So I'd tell them, deliver the tapes to me personally, and I'd look them over. And yet what they told me was true. Then I left and went to Germany. And I started picking up the same things in Germany, 3,000 to 4,000 miles overflying Germany. Again, the pencil beam radar would lock on, and all the ones that would lock would break. Just before that, I was 4 years at the White House, and I kept getting reports there. But they were just reports. I mean, and they weren't actually cast in any sense that you put them in a file and keep them all together. They just were sporadic reports that came through. Of course, I had all the clearances, so I'd get them. Even code reports I used to get and all. And I did get one time a report that NSA was getting signals from space, which were not just space noise or or unscrambled or something you couldn't read. They were really very perfect and looked like something was guiding them. There was a real message, but we were never able to decode it. This was a very coordinated message. It wasn't space noise or jam or jumble mumble or anything like that, or just noise coming. It was a pattern. So the evaluation, it might come from outer space, some beans, and I got that report when I was at the White House, because I had the NSA clearances and all. And when I came back, General Trudeau pulled me in. He had reorganized research and development from a secondary mission logistics to a very compact, good unit, about 3,000 officers. It wasn't too compact. And then I went. He made first when I reported in, I was a special assistant. Then he created the Foreign Technology Division about a week later and put me in charge of it. There I started getting autopsy reports. I started getting other crash reports. When I came to research and development, which was 14 years later, by the way, I inherited all these artifacts, and I inherited the reports, autopsy reports from Walter Reed Hospital. Now, Walter Reed, there was a laboratory there, which was our laboratory, and we financed. That's who did the autopsies for us. But we didn't leave any copies to them. All copies had to come back to us, because after all, it was our lab. We financed it all. So there I started getting indication, proof that a crash really happened here. Of course, then I kept it quiet for 35 years. I had an oath with the general, and I didn't reveal the names of people. Even he criticized me. He said, 35 years you kept a secret, didn't even tell your family. I thought, why should I tell anybody? No, the general told me, he said, Phil, let's keep it secret. When I die, though, I relieve you of my oath. 3 years ago, the general died. And I started putting all this on paper. My grandchildren, he said, what'd you do during the war? I said, I better leave them a legacy. Really, I had no intention of ever writing a book, being in the military like that. But finally it evolved and gradually moved up. I started to write, and it evolved into this finally. So that's the background, my background. And as I say, I had the evidence that a crash did happen here. The one I saw was at one of the air bases. Yeah, I'm not going to say where it was, but it was there. And that was it. I didn't go in it. And I say that I had a lot of information on what was inside. There was nothing I could gain by going inside and looking at it. I had the drawings, how it looked inside. I had what was in there. And really, to go in, it'd have been curiosity. And in those days, I didn't have the time for your curiosity. Wooler Smith is really the man that first put in my mind when nuclear binding coming apart on things. And he was a magnetic, really, he was a genius, and the Canadian government really treated him bad. And then I was supposed to go to his laboratory visiting because the general told me the general told him, Smith, he said, you and the colonel have a lot to talk about. I'll let the colonel come up and visit you at your lab on Mayber on Lake Ontario. Well, I put it off. In 1962, I decided to go up. I called up, and they told me Mr. Smith died of cancer, and I never really got to go to his laboratory. But he gave us a piece of metal that he took from a flying saucer.
You exchanged, didn't you?
We exchanged, and he brought ours back. Give us information to the young people of the world in this country. They want to hear it. They want it. Give it to them. Don't hide it and tell lies and make stories. They're not stupid. They're not young men that'll panic. In fact, my own nephew was a research director of DACO Corporation. He tells me, he says, Uncle Phil, why don't they tell us the truth? We're not going to panic and pull our hair out. And one good example of this, which I always tell, to prove this point, that the young people will want it and they're not going to panic, they want to hear this. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this. Even my own grandchildren now will see it. And I always prove it this way. I commanded a battalion of 1,500 men, combat battalion. Average age of my soldiers was 19 and a half years old. I told my exec one day, my God, Maine, we're sending babies into battle. And these kids, they fought the greatest armies in the world. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They stood there and fought. And why do you think they'll panic? They wanted this information. They deserve it. It's their information. It doesn't belong to the Army or the Department of Defense. It's theirs. If it's classified, take the classification off and give it to them.
Who's covering it up now? I mean, is there any one organization?
Look, I always say this. Now, here's what I say. The government is so big and so vast that if you leave it alone, it'll cover itself up. When I testified in front of missing prisoners of war in front of Congress, the Senate, and later, not too long ago, in front of the House. And they asked me a question like this, and I told them, look, it amazes me when a Scowcroft, a General Scowcroft, and a Kissinger can come up here in front of you, gentlemen, and say there's no information there. I sent it myself from Tokyo over teleconference over a 2-year period. How can I say that? And all the families were sitting there, and they wanted to hear this, see. Later on, we searched for it, we found it. It had fallen through the cracks. The politicians didn't care. They want their own little bailiwick, their own little ego, and do their own little job and get in the newspapers. If a person's ward missing from families, they don't care. And I brought this out when I testified. And the cover-up happens like that sometimes with nobody doing anything. It'll cover itself up and fall through the cracks, as I put it. And we never trusted CIA because in my day, Stalin gave orders to get to this information that came out of Roswell to some of his top scientists and agents. That order went out. And we knew that in the special intelligence that I was in the Pentagon, which was very closely held. KGB trying to penetrate that, but they never did. And we knew that Stalin, they send agents out all over this area here to try to get information on Roswell. And yet we stood back like fools and said it didn't exist. It was a weather balloon. They didn't think it was a weather balloon. Countries in Europe are taking this very serious, and not like us here. They're not going to put out stories that there were dummies came out of the air or people with big heads. Those people are a little more serious about this than we are. But around here, I'm even surprised to see the reaction from these people. Because somebody like me has never been out like this, and after being in the military, you don't go out and give interviews and write books and things like that. Because when we gave the information out, we gave it out and insisted they take the patents. But also we put a little bit of a requirement on there. Requirement, feed it back to us for the competitive edge of the Army. Take the patents, make all the money you want, but give it to the American people and give it to the world. The Japanese, they interviewed me, and I told them when we put the integrated circuit out, we also gave it to you. I've testified in front of 6 congressional committees. If they want me to, providing it's serious, and they're not going to put it in the archives and just put it away. And when I went to Robert Kennedy, this is a provision I put on. I would testify if I went 4 years to the White House that something is done with it, not just Congress sitting up there for publicity purpose. I'll go any time they want to. There's no hitch on me, and I'll tell them anything they want, providing they're serious. Maybe mine was a little stupidity. I kept this quiet so long, but I had an oath with the general that I wasn't going to talk till he died 3 years ago. And also other people involved. And like I told you before, I don't reveal them unless they want to come forward as bills. There's enough electromagnetism in this world where it can draw. So the extraterrestrial, he's a little different. He's composed in a way of cells also, like humans are. This structure has some metallic surroundings that has to survive in space. From debris in space, which keeps striking it constantly. It'll knock holes in it. So there's a little different strength there that will last a few more years. It is really almost a biological type of biological structure because the extraterrestrial fits in it, but made with a little more strength that's needed in the extra. Remember, these cloners that made these things made them in a way where they would fit in what they wanted them to fit in. The ship itself is maybe a biological type structure because of the cell and the atom structure. But it's all created with more strength because it has to resist more. This being is protected in a way. Now, when this being comes in this world, he will wear a suit, skin-tight suit, which we found. His skin is atomically aligned, and his suit is atomically aligned. That's to repel radiation and harmful effects, even cosmic action. Since he doesn't breathe air, the ones that come alive in this world will have a type of helmet on them. And since he doesn't speak, he has no vocal cords, he will have something that intensifies that transmission, that he maybe can communicate. Well, the head really wasn't that big, but in portions of the body, a small body, it looked big. And the brain was different, and most of the body was different. But no nose, no mouth, no ears, no vocal cords, no digestive system, no sex organs. So then we came to the conclusion that it was a humanoid clone. So that's, and as I say, when I saw the body, there was nothing else to go on. Later on, though, I got the autopsy reports that experts had done, our own experts. Discretion better part of valor. We just kept it to ourselves. Only some certain people know about it, head to head, brain to brain, no paper trail. And we were able to accomplish something. Now, discussions with the German scientists, we had discussions. General Trudeau told me one day, it took us 5 years to fully develop a transistor that somebody else started, and the integrated circuit. If we didn't have the help, like Olbert says, that we've been helped, and Smith said, the boys upstairs, it would have taken us 250 years. The message in my book that I like to see is that the younger generation look at this and see what we did and see the help we got from outer space, and these beings exist. And let the young people know that that's the future that they're going to be seeing and live with. And you got a good example. Mitchell already confirmed a lot of this. That's what I think the message of the book is, and what I like to see it do. Let the young people, we're old, we're going to be gone. Let those young people, they need this help. They're going to be the ones that carry it on. It's been right. Only through our stupidity, we didn't do it right. Whether they gave it to us intentionally, or it was a mistake, or something, that doesn't matter.
I've spent 10 years in the Marine Corps, 4 years working with the Air Force as a civilian, doing experimental testing on aircraft. Since my Marine Corps days, I was a pilot in the service, and a fighter pilot, and fought in World War II after the latter part of World War II and the Korean War conflict. After I got out of the Marine Corps, I took a job with the Air Force at Wright-Patterson, doing experimental flight testing on various different modifications and tech orders that they had incorporated into aircraft, various different aircraft, F-89, back then the B-47, F-102, and those aircraft. While I was at Wright-Patterson, of course, I was approached by an individual that, and I'm not going to mention his name, to determine if I wanted to work in an area on just new creative things, okay? And apparently that was the flying disc simulator. What they had done, they had selected several of us, and they reassigned me to Link Aviation, which was a simulator manufacturer. At that time, they were building what they call the C-11B and F-102 simulator, B-47 simulator, and so forth. And they wanted us to get the experience before we actually started work on the flying disc simulator. I don't think any went into operation until the late or early 60s, around 62 or 63. As I watched, the reason why I'm saying this is because the simulator wasn't actually functional until around 1958, where the simulator was actually operable. The simulator that they used, or the craft that they used to build, which is a 30-meter one, was the one that crashed in Arizona, Kingman, Arizona, back in 53 or 52. I think it was 53. That's the one they used. That's the first one that they took out to the test site. It was a controlled craft, you know, that the aliens wanted to present to our government, or the USA. It landed about 15 miles from, which used to be an Army air base, which is now a defunct Army base. I can't recall the name of it. But that particular craft, there were some problems with, number one, getting it on the flatbed to take it up to Area 51. They couldn't get it across the dam because of the road. It had to be barged across the Colorado River at the time, and then taken up to where people go now, up 93, out to Area 51, which was just being really constructed at the time, and taken down those dirt roads and out to that particular area of the test site. There were 4 aliens aboard that thing, and those aliens went to Los Alamos. It was a sort of a test thing. They set up the Los Alamos with a particular area for those guys, and they put certain people in there with them, people that were astrophysicists, just general scientists, to ask them questions. The way the story was told to me was there was only one of them that would talk to any of these scientists that they put in the lab with them. Only one of the aliens. The rest wouldn't talk to anybody or, even have a conversation with them. First they thought, it was all, ESP or, mental telepathy, but, most of that is kind of a joke to me because they actually speak, maybe not like we do, but they actually speak and can converse, But there was only one. The difference between this aircraft or this disc and other discs that they had looked at was that it was much simpler design. In the simulator, it was one big thing different. The thing that like Lazar calls the reactor. Okay, we didn't have a reactor. We had a space in a thing that looked like the reactor, but that wasn't the thing we operated the simulator with. We operated with 6 large capacitors that were charged with 1 million volts each. Say there were 6 million volts in those capacitors. They're largest capacitors ever built. These particular capacitors, they last for 30 minutes, so you could get in there and actually work the controls and do what you had to get the aircraft or get the simulator, the disc to operate. Okay. So it wasn't that simple because we only had 30 minutes. Okay, and the reason why it was designed like that photo I showed you was actually when it was operable, it would lift off the ball about a certain amount of there was a dimension there that we had that it actually lifted up, and it could actually turn, a certain amount of degrees left to right or whatever. But in a simulator now, you'll notice that there are no seat belts, right? And the same thing with the actual craft, no seat belts. You don't need seat belts because when you fly one of these things upside down, there's no upside down like in a regular aircraft. You have your own gravitational field right inside. So if you're flying upside down, to you, you're right side up. There weren't any windows. The only place we had any visibility at all, and it was done with cameras or video type things at that time, was in the turret section. My thing was the flight deck, and the instruments on the flight deck. I knew about the gravitational field and what it took to get people to, train them to be able to come in that thing, and operate. You would be sick or disoriented in about 2 minutes after getting in, after it was cranked up. It takes a lot of time because of the area and the smallness of it. Just to raise your hand, it becomes complicated. You have to be trained with your mind, to accept what you're going to actually feel. There's a lot of distortion.
Yeah.
Seeing, just moving about, after a while, after you get used to it and all, and you do it, it's simple. You got to know where everything is, and you got to understand what's going to happen to your body. It's no different than, accepting the G-forces, when you're flying a aircraft or coming out of a dive, and that kind of thing. It's a whole new ballgame. Each engineer that had anything to do with the design was part of the startup crew. Verify all their stuff that they put in works like it's supposed to. The whole big problem with the disc is that it's so exacting in its design and so forth, and it can't be used, say, with, it can't be used as a, like we use aircraft today with dropping bombs and you know, having machine guns, you know, in the wings and that kind of stuff. The design is so exacting that you can't add anything. You can't. It's got to be just right. There's a big problem in the design of where things are put. Say, you know, that where the center of the aircraft is and that type of thing. Even the fact that we raised it 3 feet so the taller guys could get in and stuff. The actual ship was extended back to its original configuration, but actually raised. We had a long period of introduction into meeting, you know, say an EVE, an alien. And I called him J-Rod, of course that's what they called him, but that wasn't his, you know, I don't know if that was his real name or not, but that's the name that the linguist gave him, you know. So he knew J-Rod, you know. And I did draw a sketch of him when he was, before I left him in a meeting, but, and I provided it to some people, but that was my impression of what I saw. Oh, he used to come in with Teller and some of the other guys occasionally on questions that maybe we'd have, you know. But you got to understand that everything was, you know, specific to the group. If it wasn't specific to the group, you couldn't talk about it. And you know, and he would talk, but he'd sound just like, if you spoke, he'd sound like you. You know, he's like one of the, you know, a parrot, you know, but he'd try and answer your question, you know. A lot of times you'd have a hard time understanding, you know, because if you didn't put it on paper and explain yourself, half the time he couldn't give you a good answer.
When you said there was a long build-up to actually meeting this person, what was the preparation like before you actually had a chance to have personal contact?
Well, the preparation was, you know, basically going through, first of all, I went to all of the different nationalities in the world, right? Just, you know, these, whatever, you know.
Human nationalities.
Yeah, human nationalities, you know. Then they got into going into other forms of life, you know, even down to, you know, animals and that type of thing. And the fact that, you know, this J-Rod had, his skin was pinkish, but a little bit rough, you know, and that kind of stuff. Not, you know, not horrible looking, you know, or to me he didn't look horrible looking. Some of the guys, you know, that was in the particular groups that I was in, they never even made it, you know, as far as I was concerned. You know, when they gave you the psychological question, you know, I just answered them the way I felt, and I had no problem, you know. And that's what they wanted to know. You know, if you'd become, like, you know, hey, here's an alien, he's from here, and I don't know what, you know, one of those kind of things, you know. But it never bothered me, you know, it didn't amount to much. Basically, it was only engineering advice or science advice. You know, say for example, I performed the calculation, and there's I spoke of a book that, it's not a book, it's a big assembly of various different divisions of, on gravitational technology, okay? And the key element in there, all the information wasn't there, because even our guys, our people that were the top mathematicians and stuff, couldn't figure some of this stuff out. So we would take it, and then, you know, we'd have to, with each design, you know, there's a requirement for calculations, and we'd have to prove by calculations, you know, that this thing's going to operate. No different than anything else we do. And sometimes you get into a spot where you try, and even if you use the formulas to come up with this thing that they provide you, it wouldn't work. And that's where he'd come in, you know, to tell him to look at this and see what we did wrong. So you really never knew how many we had. The last 40 years or so, or 60 years, maybe there's, I'd say 40 years anyway, not counting the simulators, I'm talking about actual craft. There's probably maybe 2 or 3 dozen various different sizes that we built.
Okay.
I don't know much about the ones that, you know, that they brought here. I know about that one out of Kingman, but that's about it. And I know the company that hauled it out of there and who's out here now. A couple different versions that they used. One was a chemical version, one was a solid version. And I don't even know the chemistry of the chemical version. But there's one that operates with under chemicals, with certain chemicals. Actually, what they've done with, I think, with these triangles that people have seen is they've got like 2 or 3 of, say, a 30-meter crafts that are in the center of it. In the outside perimeter, you know, you could put anything you want as long as these particular ones meet the design criteria. They'll operate. Then it's more or less all that other stuff on the outside is tag along. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure if they put a large weapon up there and fired it, it would probably, you know, not work. Or they'd kill themselves. There were certain reasons for the secrecy. I could understand that, no different than, you know, the first atomic bomb that they built. But, you know, they're getting so far ahead now with aircraft design, and people have come up and they're visualizing and seeing some of the design aspects that are put in some of the aircraft today. And eventually, I'm saying, like I told you gentlemen earlier, that 2003, most of this stuff will be out in everybody's plate to look at. Maybe not the way that everybody expects it, but in some manner they determine appropriate, you know, to show everybody, hey, look at what we got. See, this I call it FOGIT, or that's what they call it, fundamentals of gravitational, you know, techniques basically. But it's a volume. Now, I'm sure that manual now is just expanded. We're no different than anything else that they build for design criteria, because anything we do today, we have to have a design criteria manual, you know, and they put all the information in that. And if you ever get one of these volumes of these documents, you'd be on top of the world.
I graduated from the George School, which is a private coeducational prep school in Philadelphia, in 1958, and went into the military. After going through advanced infantry training, I was transferred to the Pentagon, where I worked for the Radio Frequency Engineering Office. I finished there, and then I joined the White House Army Signal Agency in May of 1959. I served under Eisenhower from May of 1959 until he got out of office, and then I served under Kennedy until I left the service in August of 1961. My job was to learn how to deal with code, and that's what I did. And when the process of dealing with that through military maneuvers, I learned a lot about Project Blue Book. Blue Book was discussed quite openly in the office. Sections of Blue Book were open for discussion. And then there were other matters as well that were brought to our attention one afternoon when we were just about ready to finish up training. It was about 3:30, maybe 3:45 in the afternoon. Colonel Hollibird brought out a piece of what appeared to be metallic. It was a metallic piece of looked like a yardstick. It had deciphering. It had encryption on it. And the encryption was pointed out by Colonel Hollibird to each one of us who were in that class, and I think there were 6 or 7 of us at that time. And it was told to us where that came from. And this was in connection with Operation Blue Book. What they were trying to say is, look, we've got this physical information, this physical property, and to go along with what you've seen in Blue Book, we have now been able to get our hands on and show you materially, and that's what he did. They went on to further explain that this was the material that had come from the New Mexico crash in 1947, and that was discussed. I think it was discussed at length, if I'm not mistaken. We spent perhaps another hour or so. We left about an hour late that afternoon, and the next day it was discussed again. They did discuss the fact that there were bodies, extraterrestrial bodies, yes. There were either 3 or 5, and they didn't even know at that point because some of the information that they had gotten apparently was incomplete. But 3 or 5 stands out in my mind as the number that were taken. One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened, and I do not know what may have happened to him after that. But the Army Air Force or the Air Force at that time, was very, very much concerned about Blue Book. And there were strict regulations involving anything that had to do with the reporting of a UFO or talking about a UFO. If you wanted to ruin your career, and it was told to us, I was an enlisted man, I was the lowest thing down on the totem pole, and that was made clear to us that if we wanted to mess up our career, the thing that we could do fastest was to talk about UFOs, that we were being groomed for top secret and above, and that we certainly would not be cleared for any kind of confidential material should this be released. You saw an awful lot. You saw a lot of pictures. Most of the pictures we have seen duplicates of today. Some were, the pictures that I saw were, I think, maybe a little bit better. They were taken by Air Force pilots of the UFOs. Oh, indeed they did. Yes, not only the Air Force, but some were taken by civilian pilots. Some were taken by Marine Air Corps pilots. And some were foreign. And it was made quite clear that there were a number of others that were in place in other agencies that were being used at that time that were not being put in the Blue Book. I inferred from that perhaps those pictures were better than the pictures that they were showing us. It was kind of grayish foil-like, maybe 8 to 10 inches long. I can't remember. It seemed giant-like when I saw it because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this before, and all eyes were just peeled on that particular thing. And when he told us what it was was frightening. It was eerie. There, you could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. Well, he said it had been taken from one of the craft that had crashed in New Mexico, and that had been taken from a box of materials that the military was working on. They didn't use the word reverse engineering at that time, but it was something similar to the reverse engineering that they felt like they needed to work on, and it was going to take years to do this. I do remember that there was that at the Army Engineers Fort Belvoir that they were doing a lot of experimentation at Fort Belvoir, and that surprised me. It surprised me an awful lot. Well, they look like hieroglyphics. It's hard to describe hieroglyphics, but if you've ever seen any ancient Egyptian writings, you know that that the hieroglyphics were animated in some form, and these appeared to be animated. And if I knew, the code that was supposed to be used to find out how this language was to be interpreted, then it was very expressive. You could tell it was expressive. He had a stainless steel box with a lock on it. Almost like a carpenter's box, but maybe bigger. And that's where he got this from. And that's where he put it back. And I gathered that was not the only thing that was in that box. But that's the only thing he did show. This was in the radio frequency engineering office. I did not have any more contact with the subject matter of UFOs until after I came in contact with the president. And then I had heard that he did an awful lot of doodling on paper, on notebook paper, particularly at conferences that he wasn't particularly happy with. And he would take to doodling, and one of the things that he did doodle were various forms of UFOs. President Eisenhower, yeah. I never saw Kennedy do this, but President Eisenhower did it, and he did it in my presence, as well as several other people who were attached to the White House Army Signal Agency. We had one instructor, a lieutenant colonel, and I guess his job was to not only teach us, but to make us believers as well. And that's when he produced that piece of material from what appeared to be stainless steel box. It was maybe a kind of a dusty gray-like foil that may have been burned on, looked like it may have been burned on a grill. It was made clear that it was inferred that was not the only piece of information that he had, or that the only object that he had. He had several others. Maybe the whole box was filled, I don't know. But that's the only piece he filled out. And the reason he did this was to make sure that we understood we were dealing with something that was totally out of context from what we had been dealing with earlier, and but that we might be dealing with in the future. And I think he intended for us to know that our futures were going to be dealing with this subject matter more and more. He describe them as being symbols of instruction, and that's as far as he would go. But he did infer that the instructions, whatever they might have been, were something that was important enough for the military to keep working on a constant basis. He made it quite clear that this was something that was of grave importance. We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and in those days, that was in 1959, there was a tremendous amount of security there in the base of the Pentagon. Anybody who's worked there knows what I'm talking about. You could almost carry on an entire war in the basement, and no one else would know what was going on in the floors above. So that's how secure it was. I was working on top secret. I had gotten a secret, and by the time I finished the school, I had been given a top secret, but I was to be given one step higher than that. And at that time, they didn't have a clearance specifically dealing with this problem. If you dealt with a problem, you got a Q clearance, which was a nuclear clearance. And maybe later on, they decided they were going to change that, but I remember that was the big question. How are we going to give security to our security clearances to these people who have been through this course? There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time that were, I guess you'd say, eligible to be printed or to be put in Blue Book. And the findings that were put in there were highly scientific, and they were highly gone over by the people that knew what they wanted to put in there. this information was information that would never get out to to anyone else, but it was designed for the use of particular military personnel. And so what was there was extremely exact and specific. These cases were as bona fide as they possibly could be. They were talking about people who had sterling reputations, either in the military or either in maybe a civilian capacity in some form or another, but they were not taking any loose cannons. This was information that was they thought was extremely accurate. In this country during the early 50s, numerous bases were built that would allow the president and Congress and VIPs to go in case of attack. That is, to maintain the government on its level of being able to function and so forth. And Mount Weather, Virginia, was one of those. Fort Ritchie, Maryland, was another. Camp David, Maryland, in the Catoctin Mountains, was another. And there was another one in West Virginia at that time, which we only knew as concrete. That was the code name. Mount Weather, for example, is underground. It is designed specifically to be impenetrable as far as then what we knew about atomic weaponry was concerned. But also there was equipment up there, and it was specifically told to me when I first came there. I first went on tour there because we had to go through all these places where the president would go just to familiarize ourselves on what to do and how to do it. But there was equipment up there to deal specifically with the UFO problem. It was a standard. There was a standard operating instruction, and I don't know what it was. That would have been out of my category of work, but there was a standard operating instruction on what to do with UFOs. Had been sighted around Mount Weather, not only on one or two occasions, but on numerous occasions, from what I understand. They also have been sighted in West Virginia, at the place I referred to as concrete. Stories about radar lock-on. Yes, there were, and several of those stories came out of Ohio. There was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but several others came from California, Texas, Washington, from what I can recall. But I would say there probably were between 200 and 300 cases of lock-on. And that's why those cases were in there, because they were authentic. Did I ever hear that we had ever picked up signals which could not be identified, or if they could be identified, were they coming in from strange craft that perhaps had given us or put us under surveillance? And yes, I did hear that, and I heard that from numerous, I wouldn't say numerous, but at least 5, maybe 6 reports that wound up in Blue Book. Yeah. And these, in fact, several of the reports had come in through pilots' radios. So whatever intelligence we were dealing with at that time knew how to deal with us. They knew how to communicate with us, but that they were of extraterrestrial origin. That was the belief. I was told that what they had there for us to deal with came from the New Mexico site, but there were other sites and there were other crashes. They did not say where. They were not pinpointed, but it was made quite clear that that was not the only site that they had gathered information from, and also material. The Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was brought up on a number of occasions. That apparently there were more lock-ons at Wright-Patterson than at any other Air Force base. Edwards Air Force Base was mentioned as an experimental station. And when I say mentioned in that context, I knew that it was mentioned in the area of testing whatever they had found. It was said that that's what was being done. Lock-ons had come from Edwards Air Force Base. I found that in Operation Blue Book. I was there at the same time that Philip Corso was there. When I first came to work for the president, I didn't meet him until probably a month and a half after I'd been on board. On some of those occasions, he had just been given messages or just been given information pertaining to sightings or pertaining to information about UFOs. And I know that for a fact because I was in the comm center. And I saw that information. And when he would do it, it would excite him beyond. He was just a kid. And he would get so excited and give orders like D-Day was happening all over again. He was very, very interested in shapes and sizes and what made him go. I know that. The White House itself has a huge comm center in the basement. It's run by the Air Force, but the Army's there. Every place where the president would go, including Camp David, has a comm center that deals specifically with presidential traffic. The president would continually, on an afternoon or an evening, would continually get fed information, and it wouldn't be coming from me. It would be coming usually from a warrant officer. Why, I'm not sure how that works, but that's the way it worked at that time. Usually it was from a warrant officer. So a chief warrant officer had been in the Army for probably 30 years or more. And when he would get that information, he sometimes would close himself off, and he would be alone for a while. And then he would call in whoever he needed to call in. But dealing specifically with UFOs, I can only remember on one or two occasions where that information came directly from the comm center to him. Most of the time it seemed to come, it was indirect. Most of that material, when it's passed through, it's for eyes only. And that means that if you have a direct interest in it, then you'll see it. If you don't, then you won't. You knew that there were sightings. You knew that there were new findings. If you'd been around the president long enough, you could just judge by his expressions what he was reading and what interested him. I mean, it's just something you knew from being around him. I would say that probably that was among his highest of interest at that time. Yes, indeed. It happened quite frequently. And I wouldn't dare say how many times, but it happened frequently. What happened was not one particular agency could handle dealing with the entire subject matter, dealing from the engineering portion to citing information to reporting it into Blue Book. The whole process of dealing with the UFO phenomenon could not be handled anymore by one agency. And so in order to keep it alive, and I guess as cheaply as possible, it was given to various and sundry parts of the government to work on. And I guess they thought that they could also keep the intelligence factor as secret as possible by giving little agencies a little bit here and a little bit there. And that oftentimes is done with matters like this. But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. Without him knowing it, he lost control of what was going on with the entire UFO situation. But I think he was telling us the military-industrial complex will stick you in the back if you are not totally vigilant. And I think he felt like he had not been vigilant. I think he felt like he trusted too many people. And Eisenhower was a trusting man. He was a good man. And I think that he realized that all of a sudden this matter is going into the control of corporations that could very well be used in detriment to this country. I would say that the government has done as good a job through the installation of abject fear, as good a job on this as they've done with anything within the time of the memory of modern man. I really believe they've done a job. It had been discussed with me on numerous occasions. Talked about what could happen to me militarily and what could happen to me even if I discussed this as a civilian. He discussed with me what possibly could happen should there be revelation. Is that what your question was? And he was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. I said, how do you know all this? Or something to that effect. And he said, I know. He said, those threats have been made and carried out. He said, those threats started way back in 1947. The Army was given, or the Air Force, was given the absolute control over how to handle this being the biggest security situation that this country has ever dealt with. And there have been some erasures. He was very convincing, and when he said this, and he was in a position to know. He was much older than I, and he had been involved with the CIA and the DIA both. And well, then it wasn't DIA, but he was involved with the CIA. And so he knew what he was talking about, and he wasn't just kidding. So I guess fear has done it. I don't care what kind of a person you are. I don't care how strong or courageous you are. It would be a very fearful situation because from what Matt said, he said they'll go after not only you. He said they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words. And so I can only say that the reason they've been managed to keep it under wraps for so long is through fear. They are very selective about how they pull someone out to make an example of. And I know that's been done. You can't create anything positively through fear. Fear only degenerates the human soul and the human psyche, the human mind, if you will, and that will eventually go away. We have gotten so much momentum with the secrecy that has shrouded this subject matter that we're liable to wind up in a big fat crash. I don't think that collectively we are able, at least as far as I've been able to determine, and that's granted I'm not privy to the things that I would like to be privy to, but as I see it, when you propagate a lie and propagate a fear of the truth, you put yourself in a very vulnerable position. They've been doing it for a long time, so evidently they've known how to do it. But at some point in time, because of the interest I think that the media has taken, there will be people coming out speaking that have never thought about speaking before. I think that what we're dealing with is we're dealing with certain electromagnetic devices that are powered by sources that we just don't quite understand as of yet. Well, we're certainly not advertising them anyway. But that these sources would mean free power, and free power is something that corporations panic about, and I think this government panics about it. You know, how are you going to tax free power? Looking at it from a governmental point of view, and from everyone that I've talked to who knows something about this subject matter, they do believe that the sources of energy that keep these vehicles in propulsion are sources of energy that are just as free can be. And they don't cause any harm to the environment. They don't cause any footprints to be left anywhere. Given the fact that we're having a real question about how to deal with the high price of Arab oil right now, but at some point in time, and I don't know when that will be, but at some point in time, we are going to have to be faced with the sharing of this information that will allow us to have free energy, if you will.
I spent approximately 23 years in military service and the latter 7 years as a senior foreign service officer. In my career, I spent about 15 years abroad. Since I had one of the few pilot-trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected, and as a consequence became acquainted with some outstanding scientists and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called Grudge. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force, and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. The title within the center was Project Grudge. My job was the District DO5 of Wright-Patterson. We received these worldwide reports, and my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. And I did that for approximately 2 years until the fall of 1951. When I left Wright-Patterson, Colonel Dunn was nice enough to give me a 2-page letter of appreciation for my work with Project Grudge. And so far as I know, that is certainly one of the early formal recognitions of work of an Air Force officer with Project Grudge. Now, the behind-the-scenes efforts that could have been going on simultaneously, fortunately, I was not privileged to. But I did gain a feeling in that many of the investigations were never answered. Normally in the investigative field, you have an allegation of something, or in the case of a UFO, a sighting, let's say. You carry it through to its conclusion and a result. And in many of those instances, although it's been a long time ago, I do know that there were no viable scientific results. And as a consequence, it developed my interest, or it sort of piqued my curiosity, if you will, into the aspect of unidentified flying objects. Normally my transit time, even with one time with the military police escort, was still about 12, 14 minutes. And when an object is moving a few thousand miles an hour, 12, 14 minutes is a tremendous amount of lost time. So I was never fortunate enough to see the actual tracks. But I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies. And being an intelligence officer, one of my responsibilities was to have at least a rough idea of enemy capabilities and of their equipment. We flew into, I think it was Las Vegas, Nellis Air Force Base, and Another pilot and I were driving a Goonie Bird, and normally the sky out there is either very bad or very clear. And we were coming up out of there, and I glanced up and the sky was totally clear. And an object went across from probably southwest to northeast, and it transited the entire heaven. Looking at it from my right, went out of sight on the left in probably less than 15 seconds. It was moving at a speed that I couldn't even begin to calculate. We had objects with four-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar; airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, it don't get no better than that. You're not talking about someone's imagination. And in the time frame, I heard so-called experts that the Air Force brought in, and one thing and another, from swamp gas to things like that. Anyone who flies as a professional, an airline pilot, private, Air Force, Army, Navy, military, whatever, you're exposed to literally hundreds of objects in flight that are not always clearly discernible. But normally there's a flight pattern that takes place. If it's an aircraft with wings and the laws of aerodynamics apply, you don't stop that thing and reverse it in an blink of an eye. And things like that did occur. It's, I don't know, it's sort of strange, but we send people to prison. We send people to their death because of eyewitness accounts of crimes. Our legal system is based on that to a large degree. Yet, in my following of unusual aerial phenomenon for the past 50 years, there seems to be some reason to discredit very viable and very reputable witnesses when they say something is unidentified. Well, you show me the individual that can identify everything in the heavens, and I will show you the second coming. Just that simple. Because I don't care how technically qualified you are, and for someone who is not there to voice an opinion, oh, they saw such and such and such and such. Every time I see a special on UFOs or unidentified phenomena, you always have experts. And my question is, when did they get off? What was the stop that dropped them, that qualified them to be experts? And I have a real problem with that. I truly believe that phenomena have been visiting this planet long before Project Grudge. I think there's adequate evidence of it. And the more we learn about the planet, the more we learn how little we truly know. And so the advance of science is something that has to keep evolving, and we have to keep learning. And I get real discouraged when I hear people, they think they know it, if you will. The old expression is a know-it-all, when really all they are doing is expressing their ignorance without knowing it. President Truman, who was a rather direct individual, they're violating airspace over the White House. And there's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to. So anyway, back to the story. So President Truman gets involved. He sees all of the newspaper headlines and things. He says, I want the man who's responsible for investigating these things. So I think General John Samford was the Air Force Assistant Chief of Staff Intelligence. So someone said, well, General Samford is the Chief of Air Force Intelligence. So President Truman said, is he the guy that's responsible for it? Well, they said, well, yes, sir, overall, but he said, is he handling the investigation? They said, no, sir, that would be a man out of the right path. He said, that's the man I want to brief me. So I do know that they flew Ed to Washington. While I was there, they were having a NATO exercise out in the North Sea area. And a couple of these little friendly balls of light, they were having night landings, carrier landings, and they got into traffic pattern. Well, you can imagine what happened when they came down flew over the deck without landing, needless to say, and it threw the Navy into absolute consternation, as you can imagine. Well, the newspapers picked it up, and they were, those days, able to talk to the sailors and the airmen involved. And anyway, everyone's screaming for an investigation. They say, we have no investigative agency, blah, blah. Well, to make a long story short, some years later, the group captain I worked for retired as an air vice marshal, and I ran into him. And he was air officer commanding at that time, was near Commodore in Singapore, or in Hong Kong. Anyway, we were talking about it. And I had been told by a former, I think it was a police inspector, who went from London out there and working for the Hong Kong police. And he said that the UK agency investigating UFOs was one floor above me in the same building that I worked in for 3.5 years. And yet they did not admit its existence. This is just the tip of the iceberg, because some of the very unusual sightings were in the UK. And they were talking about the little Foo Fighters that were over Germany. And strangely, the Germans thought they were ours, and we thought they were Germans. Now, in the real world, balls of light do not have a place being guided by an intelligence, being airborne, and causing consternation or playing games. And this they have been known to do, i.e. the Royal Navy. And I looked up, and directly across the street to the south, I see 11 balls of light. They look like windows in an aircraft. And all of a sudden, my mind is working a mile a minute. No, they're round. Aircraft windows are not round. Then they wouldn't be that large. We had 5 on top of 6, moving at a very nominal speed, maybe 300 or 400 miles an hour. And I just started to say something to my friend, look at that, whatever it is, and they turned off. They appeared and they disappeared. I was looking at the point in the sky when they appeared. They disappeared. So what do you do with it? So far as I'm concerned, that is totally inexplicable based on my judgment, my background, and my research. My fascination with UFOs is based on my belief that craft, intelligently operated craft, have basically violated our laws on this planet, our physical laws. And they have done that for a long time. The fact that the government, at this point, I know we've been investigating since 1947, has not come up with an answer, to me, indicates that there's something seriously wrong. Are we this incompetent in science? I don't think so. Are we this incompetent in intelligence? I know we're not this incompetent in intelligence. Now, the image put out, Project Blue Book, when it was closed by Dr. Condon's group, I have every reason to believe that this was a total deliberate whitewash. And my judgment is that there's an excellent chance that elements of the United States government, for reasons unknown, have failed to advise the public of everything that has transpired. I believe that they have been investigated for an extended period of time, and that the general public is not being made aware, fully aware. Bits and pieces, programmed responses, and things like that. So it's strange that you should be interviewing me prior to a national election, because all you have to do is turn on a television set or listen to a radio, and you hear and see the results of professional programming. We make blind men see and injured people walk and things like that, and we make people talk in a certain fashion, and we give them intelligence, and we can do a lot of things. We can also hide a lot of things. I knew from engineering manuals and from research done at MIT that if you went from totally dry air to totally saturated air, you should improve the efficiency of an engine by about 2%. Well, by humidifying air, at that time, I thought it was all I was doing, I was getting 20, 30% improvement in the efficiency of an internal combustion engine. Well, engineering people and scientists just wouldn't believe it. So I went ahead, not knowing better, I started selling them. Well, some strange things started to happen, and government agencies moved in, and particularly the Federal Trade Commission. EPA was satisfied, but no government support. Finally, the administrator of EPA had asked the director of their research lab in North Carolina if I ever showed up, if he would work with me. So I showed up without knowing that he had called him, with a diesel vehicle. Very spectacular results in that. So far as I know, it was the first diesel ever tested in a United States EPA laboratory that simultaneously reduced all aspects of measured diesel emissions, plus improved fuel economy up to 23%. So far as I know, no one has ever equaled it. The Federal Trade Commission had performed literally an illegal act. The precise statement made to the attorney for a large dealer in Washington was, we, without identifying we, don't care whether it works or not. We just don't want people buying these large American cars. I could not, when I got that report, I couldn't imagine an officer of the United States government, this is 1979-80, saying that. I flew to Washington, went into the Congress, met the general counsel. He questioned me at length. I had documentation. He then said they would act on that. When I pointed out the unfairness of the FTC aspect by documentation, he wrote a scathing letter to the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. Sent me a copy of it. Within 3 weeks from that date, I lost my vehicle, about $100,000 worth of equipment, a test vehicle, stolen. I had sponsored the U.S. Army race team on a little Sprite racing car. They stole my unit off of that car after we had just won the thing. The captain of the Army race team was a master sergeant in the Army who had created a supercar, and they stole that car from the U.S. Army in Van Nuys, California. So in 3 weeks, psychologically, I was wiped out. This is no longer just talk. There's a real world out there. And as one who had engaged in, been in and around the combat zone 9 years of my life, to have to come back to this in 15 years abroad, it was quite traumatic. So finally, after a project that I went into with the Maritime Administration, which was very successful, the conclusion was I could either add, I modified one engine on a towboat, push towboat. I could either add 20% in horsepower or 20% in fuel reduction at the same time simultaneous with reducing emissions by 40%. Near the end of the project, 2 months before, MARAD said, our agreement's off, we're going to cancel the project. And I said, you can't do this, we've done it. I said, well, I'm going to finish the project. The agreement was 50-50. I paid for the last 2 months of the test. At this point, when I finished the project, they said, we don't want 50 copies, we're not going to distribute it, we only want 10. Not only that, we want all of your notes and all of your records. I'm saying, you really don't have a right to those. Yes, we do, we paid for them. So you don't argue with the government. So I made copies of everything I had, several copies, distributed them at various points, and sent them the originals of all of this. What I did not know at the time, I put in a call to the chief engineer who had set up the project. He was never available. The number 2 engineer was never available. So I finally called the controller. And he said, they're no longer with it. I said, what are you talking about? He said, they have eliminated the research division of the Maritime Administration. So someone did not want this concept to be successful. At 2 minutes after midnight, just into my birthday, call come into my room. I'm just getting ready for bed. I got back from a little restaurant nearby. Please get out of your room, sir, immediately. And I said, well, if you tell me who you are and why, I'll get out. Well, this is the desk clerk, and this poor man's voice was breaking. He said, we've just got a call. There's a bomb in your room. I said, I don't think I'll discuss this any further, so I hung up, went out. Low motel, single thing. By this time, they're evacuating the whole motel. People get out, 12:30 at this point in the night. Police come, huge numbers, and the fire department, and one thing and another. And so I said, I'll check into a Holiday Inn, which I did. Parked, lighted area right in front of the front. This beat up old car. I let the outside get down, but the mechanics of it, and I had several thousands of dollars worth of equipment in. Next morning, 6:45, I look out, there's a blank space where my car was. They'd stolen my car. Police recovered it 2 or 3 weeks later. All of my test equipment. I had built a prototype carburetor. That was the last time I ever did that. I'd actually built the thing. And everything was gone. And psychologically, again, it sort of zapped me. So somebody was following me. My phone was tapped. No question about this. There was no logical reason for it. My unit was offered by this dealer free with every new American car, truck, or van purchased. I made that stipulation, it had to be American made. My concept really, I truly believe, I think I've just opened the door on a whole new field of science. This is not just my judgment, but at least 3 or 4 PhDs in physics, chemistry, and engineering. And out of air, I make it more than just providing oxygen for the combustion process. There are combustion stimulating molecules and radicals generated in this process. Thunderstorm in a bottle. My concept can work as a retrofit item on older vehicles and people who want to keep them, but particularly on the major polluting vehicles, which are 18-wheelers, diesel automobiles, diesel cars or buses and stuff in cities, towboats, such things, ocean-going vessels even. I think the potential is for power-generating plants based on research done in Europe, in England, and by Max Planck in Germany. I have every reason to believe it can be made to work on power-generating plants. You would not even see white smoke coming out of one. I'm 90% certain this can be made to happen with a minimal investment. Had at the beginning, 25 years ago, the oil companies gotten fully behind me and whatnot, it might extend the useful life of existing oil on this planet, which is a finite source. And they have been using a substance called MTBE for years. And this, now we're just learning. Well, we've known for a long time, but early approval of that was done without any logical scientific base. It was done on a wishful basis. Let's do this and hope it doesn't hurt. Well, it hurts. So anyway, my concept adds oxygen to the air, among other things. Everything it adds is an oxidant. It helps the planet. Even CO2, when you use less fuel. CO2 is not a controlled emission. But if I can reduce it by 20%, that is going to help the ozone layer. All right? The mixtures of various gases, including CO2. So far as I know, it is probably the most fault-free concept. And in essence, I was advised by an agency of the United States government a few years ago that if I could do what I say I can do, it was a new field of science. Well, I've known it's a new field of science since I can find no competitive concepts. It's always confused, if you will, and that's a polite term, as a vapor injector or a water injector. It is neither one of those. I have used it on a vehicle with a water injector and with a vapor injector, and it still performs. Performs a function that neither one of those perform. So it is a method of enriching the combustion air or charge air on any heat cycle engine. I've tested on propane, limited testing, extensive multi-million mile testing on diesel and gasoline. I've tested on gasoline from 75 to 125 octane. I can run a vehicle that normally requires 92 octane on 75 octane without knock and perform. And I have done so for a period of 3 months.